live. And hopefully we're good for audio. And I just want to welcome everyone here to this session. This is a new topic for ARMA NYC Long Island this year. So this session is called a Fireside Chat, the Path to Diversity. And I'm really excited to welcome our two guests today for this discussion who rallied at the last minute to fill a gap in our schedule. So many thanks for that. The first person who's going to be conducting the interview will be Jennifer Best, who is corporate vice president at New York Life Insurance Company, where she's worked for over 22 years. She began her career as litigation attorney, which ultimately led to a career in compliance and records management. Jen is also my colleague on the ARMA Metro New York City Long Island chapter board here, focusing on marketing and social media. She holds a bachelor's degree from John Jay College of Criminal Justice and a JD from Rutgers Law School. And our expert on the panel today is Jamil Guerrero. And Jamil also works at New York Life. She's the Chief Diversity Officer there, responsible for building on the company's strong diversity, equity, and inclusion, also known as DEI Foundation, and continuing to embed a diverse and inclusive culture into New York Life's talent practices, business strategy, and community engagement. Most recently, Ms. Guerrero served as Chief Operating Officer of Index IQ, a New York Life investments boutique. She joined New York Life in 2011 as Director of Finance for both New York Life Investment Management and NYL Investors. And since then, she's held positions of increasing responsibility, including Managing Director, Head of Global Marketing Operations for NYLIM. Prior to New York Life, Ms. Guerrero was controller of the Fireside Company and controller of Muirfield Capital Management, both investing firms. She graduated from the University of Central Florida with a BS in accounting. And now you're going to hear about her transition as a dynamic and passionate driver of DEI efforts, both within and outside of New York Life. She served as co-lead of the company's social justice working group, advising social justice steering committee established in 2020. And then the group's recommendations included evolving New York Life's Office of Diversity and Inclusion to become the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Center for Awareness and Advocacy, which focuses on continuing inclusion and engagement initiatives while expanding professional development with a goal of personal growth and career mobility for diverse employees. In addition, Jamil is an advisory board member of New York Life's Latinos for Excellent Advancement and Development, which is known as LEAD Employee Resource Group, and she previously served as co-chair of Enable, the company's ERG dedicated to raising disability-focused awareness. She also recently became a board member of the Reasons to Smile Foundation, Inc., a nonprofit dedicated to helping people with intellectual and developmental disabilities reach their potential within the workforce and community. For her work in advancing DE&I, Jamil was included in Profiles in Diversity Journal's inaugural list of Latino leaders worth watching in 2021. Welcome, Jamil and Jen.
I'm going to
turn this over to you, and I am going to disappear.
Okay.
Thanks, Joy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joy. Thank you for introducing us. So, Jamil, I'd also like to thank you for, at the last minute, agreeing to participate in the Confirm New York City conference this year.
Sure.
While Joy... Oh, yeah, exactly. So while Joy did speak about your background, which is very impressive, I thought we'd still kick things off by having you talk about your career path and how that led you to your current position as Chief Diversity Officer at New York Life.
Yeah, as you heard from my very long bio, as she was reading it, I'm like, we've got to come up with a better one for speaking because I think it's rather long. But yeah, I studied accounting in college and actually almost didn't go into accounting. I actually thought I was going to become a lawyer. Jen, I don't know if you and I spoke about that, but I was going to go to law school and do all that. I was a legal secretary for a couple of years and decided not to do that and finally, stepped back into accounting a few years after graduating from college. And I went to work at a small public accounting firm and just got really lucky. I was at a small public accounting firm that happened to specialize in high net worth. startup investment management companies, kind of hedge fund of funds. And so I did audits and tax and fund administration. I did the books for some of my clients, and it was just very varied work. And so I was able to kind of go broad and go deep because our clients were smaller, and did that for a few years and ended up getting hired by a client to be their controller at a hedge fund of funds. And I did that for about 5 years. And then during the crisis of 2008, 2009, had to kind of jump ship that the company was not doing as well. And so I went over to a private equity firm called Riverside Company and was controller there for 2 years. And that was all great work. I mean, I was looking for something closer to home, and I had 2 little ones at the time. And so I interviewed at New York Life, and there was a financial planning and analysis job that was open. And it was specifically at that time to help support some of the alternative boutiques that we owned. So New York Life is an insurance company, but we also have an investment side of the house, and we have the side that invest our policy dollars, our general account, but we also have a kind of a third party asset management business. And so it was to help support some of that work. I did that for about 3.5 years. But really my passion was more for people and process, and started making my way over to more operational roles. So I first became a chief of staff within the finance organization, did that for a couple of years. But that was 2 years where I spent on the life insurance side, Jen, because it gave me the opportunity to learn about that side of the business without doing any kind of actuarial or finance work on the insurance side, which is very different. Then I came back to NILM to be kind of run a project management office and communications. And I was in that seat when they hired a new chief marketing officer of New York Life Investments, and had done a couple projects for him. And he asked me when he was reorganizing his organization to run marketing operations for him. And at that point, I think you and I were talking about this yesterday. I think I might have actually told him he was nuts, because it was very different for anything I've ever done before, and I had zero marketing experience. But I went to do that, and it was a tough jump from one seat to the other. But I was there for almost 4 years, I think, maybe a little bit over. And then after that, I went to be COO, Chief Operating Officer at Index IQ, which is a small boutique within the New York Life investment family that runs our ETF products. And I was only there for a little over a year before I got tapped to do this role. And I think, usually at this point in the conversation, people say, wait, you're Chief Diversity Officer. So how do you make that connection? I think for me, my extracurricular time was always spent, my passion time, if you will, was always spent on the diversity side. It started with getting involved with our ERG, focused on our disability community. I have a son that has autism, and so that was my natural connection. And I co-chaired that ERG for a couple of years. And then just stayed very connected to all the ERGs. And a couple of years ago, after the murder of George Floyd, the company formed a social justice steering committee at the top of the house, made up of leaders. And then they formed a social justice working group made up of employees to help inform, kind of think about where might there be gaps or opportunities for us to even do better in this space. And so we worked for a year on that and ended up making a set of recommendations. So that's how I stayed close to the DE&I space. And then 2 years after that project ended, I was offered this role. And so it's actually the perfect kind of job for the combination of my business experience and my passion for diversity.
Yeah, so you could really see the evolution. I mean, you've really had a varied career.
Very, yes.
Yeah. Based on your, background, knowledge, and experience, how would you define diversity, equity, inclusion, its benefits, and perhaps also maybe put it into the context of what that looks like at New York Life?
Sure. So, there's a lot of words being thrown around, and I think defining them is important, understanding the difference between them, and new ones get added every day, every year. But if you think about diversity, it's really the mixture of backgrounds, experiences, characteristics that make each of us unique. So think about representation, right? Kind of the numbers. To me, equity, and to New York Life, equity is really the pursuit of fairness, that we're looking at everybody on the same level. Inclusion to me is really about making sure that you're being noticed and valued for your differences as a person. And then I'm going to throw in belonging too, because I think this is a new word that's been coming up a lot. And to me, that really means feeling like you can bring your full self to work And this new concept, which another word that's being thrown around, is psychological safety, right? That you can share your ideas, share your background without feeling like you're going to be put down or shamed for it. As far as the benefits, it's like bringing different perspectives in, right? So for me, I'm a Latina woman, but I was born in Puerto Rico. I lived there till I was about 5 or 6 years old. My dad was in the Air Force. My stepdad moved around a lot. I went to 12 schools between kindergarten and high school, right? So
Wow.
I met a lot of people along the way. I've lived in Jacksonville, Arkansas. I've lived in the Virgin Islands, Okinawa, you name it. And so to me, what that's taught me is that bringing in different perspectives is really incredibly important. And I think it's beneficial for everyone. Specifically at New York Life, the way we bring this to life is through our ERGs, through our programming. So our ERGs, we have 7 of them. And we have, the Women's Initiative. We have our Asian Pacific Circle. I'm not going to name them all, but we have LEAD, which is our Latino organization, BOLD, and a few others. And so that's one way that it manifests itself. The other one is through programming. And so over the last few years, especially I would say the last, 8 years, we've done a really great job of having those courageous conversations when kind of difficult topics come up. I think we've made it part of our culture that these are things we can speak about, and we're learning how to do that, and kind of thinking about it from this mentality of continuous, learning. And so that to me has really infiltrated our company in really great ways. And so you see it kind of come out in our culture.
Yeah, I can absolutely say that I do agree with you. And I've been working, at New York Life for 22 years, and I've always been very impressed in how the company has evolved. And I've enjoyed the programming that we've had, particularly these past few years. One of the things we talked about in preparation for our session today was how could we make this meaningful for our group? So many people attending the conference are records management and information governance professionals. So perhaps we could turn to, how does diversity impact or should impact the creation and use of data?
Yeah. So I think it's really important when you're looking at data to consider, diversity in metrics. I think when you're looking at data to make decisions, I think it's important that you don't just look at monoliths. For instance, if we think about women, if we're thinking about how women are being represented at our company, or how we're working to help develop programs for leadership advancement and things like that, that we don't only look at women, but maybe we look at women at different levels, or we look at women that we might look at Latino women versus Asian women, and those experiences could be different, and how we address the needs of each group might be different. So really taking a targeted view, and that's why also the ERGs I think are so important, is to help give you that lens from different perspectives in addition to the data, because I think data is quantitative and qualitative. And I think those two things should always go together, because the numbers can tell you so much, but I think also getting some qualitative data and how people are feeling is important as well. So I think just from purely looking at data to make decisions, but then also when you think about starting to involve business leaders in this kind of mission of DEI, I think it's really important to lead with data, because sometimes there's thoughts that this, that it may not be data driven, right? That this may be just how people feel, which goes back to what I said on the qualitative side. But I think when you're talking to business leaders, they're going to want to know, what are the facts? Where do I need to go from a data perspective? Like, what do my numbers look like today, and what would we like them to look like tomorrow? But then also, Jen, I think it's also taking a look at external data, industry data, to see how diversity is impacting business, because I think if you look at it, it really does have a positive impact on business, not just how our employees feel, which is incredibly important, but also on business outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things we talked about was, when we encourage more diversity, when we're looking at the data, people are going to have very different perspectives, based on where they're coming from, being either, as a white woman or a Latina. We can look at the same data, but interpret it differently, right?
Yeah, Absolutely. Yeah. So, but I think it's also important but I think that's why the data is important, because you're starting from a foundation of facts, right?
Yeah.
And then you can kind of help figure out what story that those facts are telling you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, given the benefits of, particularly of inclusion, what would you say, how can we be sure as individuals that we actually are being inclusive, particularly given the benefits to, for example, our business and our professional development?
Yeah. I mean, I think you always can just get a different perspective, right? So, how can we be more inclusive? You have to almost practice that muscle, right? We're not going to have it naturally. Our experience is our experience. And Jen and I were talking about this last night as well, is that even within, I said earlier, I'm a Latina woman, but even as a Latina woman, given my experience that I mentioned, my experience is my experience. And I have, like I said, I have a son with autism, and I have a lot of friends who have children with autism, and our children are all so very different. And so you could almost bring it down to the specific person level. But I think it's important just to get different perspectives around you. So if you're thinking, like, for instance, a few weeks ago, we had a program that was focused on a specific demographic that I was not very familiar with, or that really I didn't have any personal connection with. So I reached out to a colleague of mine in the organization to make sure that I was being sensitive, that I was saying the right things, that there wasn't anything in my talking points that might be received in a way that I wasn't intending. And she was awesome to help me kind of think through my speaking points and through the slides we were using to make sure. And it was interesting because I even offered her to do the speaking part and to do the introduction to the session. And she actually said she was happy for me to do it, because she thought it was important for an ally to get up on the stage and speak about this topic. So it was a great exchange of ideas on our part. So I think tapping into the resources around you, and really, like, thinking with intentionality of trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And then the other thing, Jen and Joy and I were talking about as we were preparing for this session too, is coming from a place of kind of grace, right? I think in this day and age, there's just so much information out there, and kind of acknowledging that at some point I'm going to mess up and say something that I probably shouldn't have said, or acknowledging that at some point I'm going to be kind of the person who messes up, as well as the person who may feel offended in some way. And that allows us to have a little bit of grace, right? We're going to find ourselves on both sides of the equation. And there are times when that's not the case. There are times when it's just blatant, sexism, racism, whatever. And, we're not going to act with grace for those. But, think about a friend of yours or a colleague who you know very well that may say something that seemed out of turn. Maybe you approach that person and say, hey, I know that was not your intention. That's not like you, let's flesh out what you said, or something like that. And being able to have those conversations is important. I think the other thing that is important to acknowledge is that it's an ever-changing landscape. And I'll give you a great example. So as I mentioned, my son has autism, and we were preparing a note recently that was going to go out to our employees for Autism Awareness Day. And I received the note, and I was reviewing it. And it's interesting, even though I'm newer to this role, just the lens that I'm looking at things through. And the note, really kind of started to focus on, or initially focused on, the challenges of autism. And I just encouraged my team to take a look at that and say, look, yes, there are challenges, absolutely, but here are some positives. And so as I was Googling just anything that we could find on some, speaking points that we could use in the note, I also discovered that it is increasingly being called Autism Acceptance Month, rather than Autism Awareness Day. And so Autism Awareness Month. And I think all of these things are evolving little by little. So we're all learning and trying to do our best to make sure we're being inclusive and using the right language, at all times, but acting with grace.
Absolutely. Earlier on, you were talking about certain programming that New York Life has and all the resources. For this conference, we do have people that are consultants or work for smaller companies and might not have, the same support as we do, working for a larger company. For those individuals, what suggestions would you have for them in terms of getting more plugged into diversity?
Yeah. Yeah, so for people who are consultants, you may not work for a company that has ERGs and all of that. I think tapping into some trade organizations like this one that can help you, connect with others in your field, maybe even possibly uh, coming up against the same issues or things that you want to bounce off of somebody else. I know Jen, you and I had talked about ARMA does have the mentorship program that I think you've been a part of that might be helpful in connecting, people who are not part of bigger organizations with others in the community.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been participating in the mentorship program for many years, and it's very well run by ARMA International. And I've definitely met a diverse group of people, and I've found it to be very beneficial, not only as a mentor, but also as a mentee. So I would highly recommend people consider participating in the program. So, thinking more broadly, what are some of the resources you would recommend for people to become more informed about, diversity and inclusion, not only just in the workplace, but maybe even, as part of their everyday life?
Yeah. So I'll go through a few that we were discussing. One is I mentioned Google earlier. I think you have to be careful with Google. Make sure it is a reputable source that is an expert or a good source for the area that you're looking into. But for instance, we were talking about different language and different words and how they're changing day to day. And so again, make sure your source is reputable. But go on and look up. Sometimes somebody uses a word in the DE&I space that I may not even be familiar with. So I'll Google it real quick to try and understand what that word might mean. And then once I hear the word, maybe I go out to someone in that community that's a part of and get more information. Which leads to my second one is talk to others. I've heard this in the last couple of years. It's come up a couple of times, but it came up last week. Something says proximity breeds empathy. And I thought there's such a great few words, right? Because the more you get to know people that are not like you, the less likely you are to think of them as different, And so some of the best experiences I've had, both in my personal and my professional life, have been where I have just sat down and talked to someone and asked them about their experience. I think you want to do it thoughtfully and make sure that the person is willing to open up and talk about their experience. But, I could think about this was maybe going back in my public accounting days. So I was probably in my mid 20s at that time. I was on an audit and I was with another gentleman on that audit, and we were having dinner, just the two of us. And he was of a different religious faith. And I was so curious. And I asked him first, I said, hey, would you mind if I asked you a few questions about your religion and your experience? And it was one of the best conversations I think I ever had. And what was interesting that it was his religion was different from mine. But what I discovered in that conversation were all the things that we had in common, or that our religions had in common, more than we had different. And so it really kind of unlocked something for me that I've carried forward in the future, to have those conversations with people, whether it's somebody of a different race or from a different country or from a different religion, to have those conversations. It helps build that empathy muscle, to help you understand others. And then, by the way, going back to what we were talking about earlier, when you're sitting down looking at a note, you're able to maybe more and more put yourself in somebody else's shoes. I think industry conferences like these and educational sessions are important. A lot of companies, trade organizations, conferences are starting to have a DE&I component, and so going to those sessions and educating yourself around that. And then there's always books and programming on unconscious bias or other things too that Jen and I were talking about. You know, as I had said earlier, I think DE&I has always been a part of my passion in some way, shape, or form, like this conversation I had in my mid-20s. A little bit further in my career was just a few years later, I interviewed a gentleman for a role in my company at the time, and a bias came into my mind almost immediately when I met the person. And I ended up interviewing him and quickly pushed the bias aside and realized that this guy was incredible. He was really well qualified and all of that. But I kind of realized what I had done. I almost wrote him off before I gave him a chance to interview. And after the interview, I walked into my boss's office, in tears, and I said, I had realized what I had done, and what I could have done if I had not realized it in time. And he recommended the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. And I read that, and that talks a lot about unconscious bias. And so going back to what I said earlier, it's not about not having bias. We're all going to have it. It's going to creep in, but it's really about practicing that muscle of recognizing it, understanding where it's coming from, and then kind of putting it to the side and understanding that it doesn't have a place maybe in that decision-making process. So that's one great book, Blink. And then the second book, I actually have it here on my desk, is it's called Say the Right Thing. It's by Kenji Yoshino and David Glasgow. Kenji came to speak at one of our events a few weeks ago. And the book it's a great book. It really talks very openly about having these conversations. It talks about something called this empathy triangle, where you're thinking about how you are as an ally, the person that might be affected, and the person that might be the offender, and how you can react to some of these situations we might find ourselves in. And he also ends the book with this whole concept of grace, of really not coming from a place of, oh, you messed up, gotcha, and now you're the bad person. It's really about getting better at having these conversations and becoming better allies to each other.
Absolutely. So I'd like to pause at this point just to see, Joy, if we have any questions. I didn't see any come up on the chat, but we can open up the room for questions before we sort of wrap up. I have just one other item I wanted to cover with Jamil.
I can put those book titles in the chat if that helps folks. I don't see any questions coming up yet. I was reflecting a little bit, though, Jamil, on sort of what happened after George Floyd. I felt like that was a huge impetus for companies to really get their acts together and work on some sort of employee working group or diversity initiatives. I feel like that was a really huge signal for us as a society.
Yeah, and it's an important time, Joy, because I think you get the further you get away from those moments of impact, the less, I want to say the less of a priority it becomes, but it's not as top of mind. And then we get back into our regular way of working and doing. And so you have to be a little bit more intentional to make sure that you're continuing to push that, through that journey. And I think that's where a lot of companies find themselves today, and making sure that this is still a key area of focus. I think what that did, though, and I know it did it here in New York Life, was created space for us to have really difficult conversations. They were already happening, but I remember the call that we had where the EMC sponsor for our BOLD, which is our Black ERG, and another member of our EMC had a conversation about what had happened. And it was one of the most impactful conversations I've ever heard. And it was just really true and raw.
We had some of those sort of temperature check things that ended up being they were really emotional conversations. I remember learning a lot about my colleagues. So Lacey Siegel has a question. She wants to know about your first year. What do you hope to achieve in your first year as Chief Diversity Officer in your role?
Yeah. So I think first of all, I don't know if we mentioned that in the intro. I've only been in my role since February 2nd, and actually, because I was in New York Life in a prior role. Really, it was like March 1st in earnest when I took on the role. So I've been in the role for all of 10 weeks or so. I think for New York Life, what's really awesome is New York Life just developed the Office of Diversity and Inclusion back in 2006, and so. That is what 13. Sorry, not 13. I can't even do my math. 17 years later. 17 years later. The great thing is we have a great, mature, and robust programming at our company, and we have it where it comes to ERGs, when it comes to programming, our development programs. When we did the social justice working group work a couple of years ago, one of the things that came out is we evolved the office from the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, ODI, to the DE&I Center. And before that, it was really more about awareness and engagement. So it was our ERGs, it was programming. So we were having some of these courageous conversations that we've been talking about. We had developed the Coming Together series, which is where we talk about unconscious bias. We have one called Color Brave versus Color Blind. We have one called Bridging Blind Spots. So we had a lot of that work that was already underway. And what we did out of the social justice working group is we recommended a set of initiatives called the DE&I Center. And it was really to advance advocacy and help all employees, but specifically, diverse employees, have a place where they could go for career help, mobility, networking. One of the things that we saw in our research was how important networking is to the advancement of somebody's career, and how some groups felt that their networks weren't as robust as they needed to be. And so we've developed programs, mentorship, networking, development programs geared towards helping folks advance in their careers and opting into some of these programs, meaning that they can sign up for them. And come to the DE&I Center for help. So that's kind of some of the work that's been done. So I always say I'm incredibly blessed to be coming into an area that's already has an amazing foundation that's been built. And so that's a blessing and a curse, because you also sit here and you say, okay, what can we do more of, or how can we add value? And as I come into my role, I think there's a couple of things that are important. One, as I mentioned before, my strengths are people and process. And so as I come into the DE&I Center, I think just helping with process and making sure that we're prioritizing and we're doing the right things and we have the right processes around the right things. That's probably not the most fun thing, but I think it'll help build scale within our organization. The other two things that I think we need to focus on, New York Life recently hired a new head of talent. Her name is Tina Gupta, and she's pretty awesome. And I think it's working with her to really think about not only our talent strategy, but how does DE&I play a part in that that talent strategy. So how are we thinking about acquisition? How are we thinking about retention? How are we thinking about development of our diverse employees within the organization? And like every other company, like a lot of other companies, how do we help increase representation at more senior levels in the company? And then the last thing, and one of the things I wanted to do coming into my role is to speak to other chief diversity officers in the industry, or actually outside of the industry too, meaning in the diversity industry, but outside of the necessarily financial services industry that we're in. And if it's one thing I think I've heard consistently is we need to get more business leader involvement to move the needle forward. And so I think that's one thing I want to be focused on over the coming months and years. And it's not just having employee-led, HR-led initiatives, but really getting business leaders involved in the diversity of their teams and why it's important for them. And Jen, going back to what we were talking about earlier, data is going to be
exactly
important to do that, because business leaders, I think a lot of them obviously are empathetic, but they're going to want to see, want to understand why this is important to them and their business outcomes.
Right. And that's something that we focus on in different contexts, as records management professionals. Business leaders respond to data. You could talk to them about benefits and risk and things of that nature. But at the end of the day, not surprisingly, it really comes down to, okay, sometimes it could be financial. It will save you X amount of money, or other qualitative and quantitative benefits.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm looking at the chat. I don't believe we have any further questions. So at this point, I know we've covered a lot of ground in our chat today, but I wanted to check in to see if there was anything else that you wanted to talk about that we didn't have a chance to cover as of yet.
I think we covered most of it. I think what I would say is, you don't, sometimes it seems overwhelming, what we want to do from a DEI perspective, as far as representation. For some people, they want to conquer the world, they want to change the world today, and I think little things matter. And for some others, they just want to know, like, what are the little things that they can do to get involved, to do something. So start small. If you are part of a larger organization that has ERGs or ENGs, or your company might have a different name for those things, get involved. Talk to a friend. Just try and meet somebody of a different background than your own. If you're a leader, that's on the call today, reach out to folks that are more junior to you in your organization, and get to know them and find out about them, and what makes them tick, and what are their career aspirations. I think it's just natural for us as leaders to mentor or sponsor or speak to folks that look like ourselves. And so sometimes I think we just have to be more intentional in doing that. And so just find little ways in your everyday to be more inclusive. It doesn't have to be the big ticket items. It could be small things you do throughout, even just educating yourself, listening to a podcast, or reading a book.
Exactly. And, what resonated for me was when you were talking about having that interview and you had a bias come into your mind. And it's just, I guess, just being generally even just more aware of, what are my biases, and what does that look like? How can it play out, and being more intentional?
Yeah.
I know as a supervisor, I often try to come with that mindset.
It's true. Even just asking yourself a question, Jen, I think you bring up a great point. Just kind of, checking yourself, holding yourself accountable. When something does drop in your mind, is this like factual, or is this just sentiment? Is this something that's kind of been ingrained because of, what we see in the news and the media, or in advertising every day? And then, really thinking through, like even now when I think about my employees, and when I'm developing them or giving them feedback, it's really looking at it through the lens of, is this really based on their performance, or is this based on something else? And really kind of asking yourself those questions to make sure you're being kind of equitable in your approach.
And also giving yourself grace, because sometimes when we think about things, we can feel judgmental, not only towards others, but towards ourselves, and just saying, you know what, I may be thinking this, but, let's turn it around. Let's look at it a different way.
Yeah. And it happens to me all the time. And it happens to me in my own, how do I say this, in my own experience, meaning, so I'm originally from Puerto Rico. My husband his background is Mexican. His mother lives with us, and she's Mexican. And there was something that we saw last week that a friend of mine commented on around Cinco de Mayo, and they said they saw something that was inappropriate. And I did not catch it. And I am chief diversity officer, and I am Latina, and I am married to a Mexican man, and I did not see that from that lens. It took somebody else pointing it out to me. So, and even like, again, even with my son and certain things, we just all see things differently. And so that's why it's always important to create an open environment where people can come to you and say, hey, did you see this? And how did that land with you? Because it didn't land well with me. And in that conversation, I had to kind of sit back and I almost challenged them, because I didn't see it. And so we were able to have a really good conversation. But I think that's why, creating that environment within our companies to be able to do that is great, because that conversation was not contentious at all. It was a great conversation about what we could do better next time. And so that's kind of, I think, where we want to get to.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I'm just taking a look at the chat. Thank you, Rishi, for your comment. He said he was enjoying our chat on diversity. And thank you, Joy, for putting the resource or reference materials in the chat for everybody. So with that, I'd just like to thank you again, Jamil, for joining us in this conference this year. And yeah, I appreciate
Thank you
it.
for having me, and hope you guys enjoy the rest of your conference.
Okay. Thank
Take
you.
care.
Take care, everybody. Bye.